My name is Evelyn. I'm 70 years old, and on the morning of my birthday, I learned that sometimes it is not the big betrayals that change your life forever, but the smallest, quietest moments when someone you love forgets to remember you. And that is how one missing phone call set in motion a choice that would turn my entire future in a direction I had never imagined. The day began with the soft light of early autumn spilling across my kitchen table, the kettle beginning its gentle chatter, and the comfortable creak of floorboards under my slippers, each familiar sound greeting me like an old friend. And as I moved through my little house with the slow, sure rhythm of someone who knows where every cup and spoon belongs, I felt that extra sparkle the morning of your birthday is supposed to bring, as if the air has been polished just for you, and I placed my phone on the counter beside me so I could hear it instantly when my son called, because for as long as I can remember, that call was the most precious part of the day. I peeled an orange the way I always do, trying to keep the peel in one long, curling ribbon the way my mother taught me, the bright scent filling the room, and I told myself there was no need to watch the clock because he might be on his way to work or busy getting his own children ready for school, and love does not always keep pace with the minutes on a dial. The house felt safe and warm, with the vase of daisies I had bought for myself the day before sitting cheerfully on the table, each golden face turned toward the morning light as if asking for nothing but to exist. And for a while I let their quiet brightness fill the space where anticipation was beginning to hum softly in my chest. By midday, I had fed the little stray cat who pretends she does not know me, folded a towel still warm from the dryer, and opened a card from a neighbor who always signs her name with a little swirl at the end. But still no call had come, and I reminded myself not to worry, that perhaps he had planned something later in the day. And yet, with every small glance at my phone, I could feel the tiniest sting, the kind you almost ignore until it grows sharper, simply because it has stayed too long. As the sun began to tilt toward afternoon, pouring long golden lines across the floor, I wandered to the shelf that holds my blue photo album, the one with the peeling corner, and found myself touching the picture of a little boy with frosting on his fingers and a crown made from a cereal box, his eyes looking at me as though I were the tallest and safest thing in his world. And the warmth in my heart then was so real I could almost feel it in my hands. When evening came, I set a single plate at the table, cut a slice from the cake I had bought at the bakery, used the good fork because there is no reason to save joy for a special day when the day itself is supposed to be special, and the house glowed softly in the light of my favorite lamp. Yet the phone lay silent beside me, still as a stone, and I found myself wondering why a device so small could feel so heavy when it stayed quiet for too long. By the time I cleared the plate and rinsed the fork, the sky had deepened into that gentle indigo that comes just before night, and I went to bed telling myself I would not let disappointment follow me into my sleep, though in truth I woke often, drifting in and out of memories that reminded me how much I had given over the years, and how many times I had quietly placed myself last in my own life. It was the next morning, well past 10, when the screen finally lit up with a short message, just a handful of casual words that could have been typed while standing in a grocery line or walking to a car. And as I read it, I felt something inside me shift with a small but undeniable click, the kind of click that happens when a thought you have been keeping at the very edge of your mind suddenly steps forward and refuses to be ignored. I stood very still in my kitchen, looking out at the yard where the wind chimes barely moved and the herbs on the steps waited patiently for watering, and I thought about how I had arranged my life as if gratitude and respect were promises carved in stone, only to realize that perhaps they had been written in dust all along. I am not a woman who believes in angry decisions, and I have never thought money was the same as love. But I do believe that the things we work for over a lifetime should go where they will be treated with care and appreciation. And as I opened the drawer where I keep small odds and ends, My hand found a folded pamphlet I had tucked away months ago from a local organization that helps older women steady their lives when they have no one else to lean on. I smoothed the paper flat on the counter and read it again, remembering the faces I had seen at the community center. Women with gentle smiles and strong eyes, women who share recipes and stories, who know the value of kindness because they have lived through the lack of it. And I felt a warmth that was not about revenge, but about choosing to let my life's work end up in hands that would hold it as carefully as I have. That morning, I made a list in my small notebook, the one I keep for decisions that matter, writing down the house I had worked decades to pay off, the savings account that had grown slowly through years of thrift, the investments I had chosen with patience and guarded through storms. And as I wrote, the idea of leaving these things where they might be truly valued began to take root in my mind like a seed planted in good soil. By the time the afternoon light softened, the decision was no longer just an idea. It was something living, breathing, and waiting for me to give it form. I picked up the phone, called the office of the woman who had helped me with important papers before, and set an appointment, my voice calm and steady, as if I were simply confirming the weather. When I hung up, the house was still, but it no longer felt empty. Instead, it felt ready, like a clean kitchen waiting for a new recipe. And I stood at the window looking out over the yard, realizing that even at 70, it is possible to change the ending of your own story. That is when I understood that one forgotten birthday call had not broken me. It had woken me, and what I was about to do next would change everything, not just for me, but for people who might never even know my name. The day after my birthday had the kind of muted light that makes everything outside look as though it has been gently washed in pale watercolors, and I woke later than usual, my body heavy with a quiet fatigue that did not come from lack of sleep, but from the way disappointment settles into the corners of your mind when you try to ignore it. My first thought was not of the weather or of what I might have for breakfast, but of the small message that had arrived the day before, the handful of words sent so casually that they seemed almost lighter than air, and yet they carried the weight of years I could suddenly see more clearly than I ever had before. There was no malice in those words, but there was also no warmth. And I realized as I sat on the edge of my bed that sometimes the absence of warmth can chill you faster than the presence of cold. I moved through my morning routine with the kind of automatic grace that comes from decades of repetition. Boiling water for tea, feeding the cat who slipped inside when I opened the door, straightening the quilt on the couch. But all the while my mind was walking back through time, revisiting small scenes I had long kept, wrapped in the soft cloth of excuses. I remembered the school concert where I had saved a seat in the front row, only to find it empty when the curtain rose. The first time he had promised to visit for Thanksgiving, but called instead to say he was busy with other plans. The birthdays over the years when the call came so late in the evening that the day felt like an afterthought. I had always told myself that he was busy, that his life was full, that this was the way of things when children became adults, and perhaps all of that was true. But it was also true that each moment had left a mark, and now those marks were joining together like a map that led me somewhere I had not wanted to go before. The house was still, holding its breath around me, as if it knew I was about to say something out loud to myself that I had avoided for too long. I stood at the kitchen counter and stared at the folded pamphlet from the foundation, the one I had smoothed flat the day before, and I thought about how many women might be sitting alone in their kitchens right now, women who had worked hard, given much, and ended up with very little, women who could do so much more with a little help. The idea of leaving my home, my savings, and the pieces of my life to a place that could truly transform someone's tomorrow began to feel less like an option and more like an inevitability, as if it had been waiting quietly for me to notice it all along. Later that morning, I pulled out the large manila folder where I keep important documents, its edges worn soft from years of being handled with care, and I spread everything out on the dining table, The deed to my home, the statements from my accounts, the records of the small investments I had nurtured over the decades. I looked at each one the way you look at old photographs, seeing not just the numbers and ink, but the story behind them. The extra hours I had worked to pay down the mortgage faster, the careful way I had chosen each investment, the sacrifices hidden in every deposit to my savings account. These papers told the story of my life just as much as any photograph album could, and I realized that I had the power to decide the final chapter of that story while I was still here to write it. In the afternoon, I put on my coat and walked the few blocks to the small park at the end of my street, the one with the bench under the elm tree where I have often sat in the summer with a book or in the winter with a cup of coffee in my gloved hands. The air was cool but not biting, and the leaves made a soft ticking sound overhead, as if the tree were keeping time for me while I thought. I watched two women about my age walking slowly along the path, their heads close together in conversation, and I found myself wondering what stories they might tell if someone asked them, how many joys and losses they had folded into the years, and whether they too had ever been reminded in a single small moment that affection without respect is like a house without heat. It can stand, but it never feels truly warm. By the time I returned home, the sun was already low, casting that amber light that makes even ordinary rooms look like something out of a memory, and I sat down with my notebook to write out the steps I would need to take next. I did not rush. Each word felt like a small act of clarity. First, a meeting with my attorney to revise the will. Second, a quiet visit to the foundation to understand exactly how my contribution could be used. Third, the practical business of organizing my affairs so that there would be no confusion later. I closed the notebook and placed it in the drawer beside my bed, feeling a calm I had not known the day before. The calm that comes from finally deciding to act instead of endlessly thinking about acting. That evening, as I prepared a simple supper and listened to the low hum of the refrigerator, I glanced at the phone on the counter and realized something had shifted inside me. I no longer felt the constant pull to check for messages, no longer waited for the small flash of light on the screen to validate my place in someone else's thoughts. The truth was simple. My life, my choices, my legacy, they were mine to shape, and it was up to me to decide whether they would be remembered as an afterthought or as something that made a lasting difference. When I went to bed that night, I felt lighter, not because anything had been resolved yet, but because the path ahead was clear. One forgotten birthday call had shown me exactly where I stood, and the view from that place was sharper than I expected. I was not standing in loss. I was standing at the beginning of a choice that would change everything. 2 days later, the morning air carried that crisp, early winter bite that makes you draw your collar closer even before the wind touches your skin. And as I stepped out of the house, I felt an unusual mix of calm and anticipation, the kind that hums quietly under your ribs when you are on your way to do something that feels both necessary and irreversible. I had called ahead to the Foundation's office and arranged to stop by without any particular agenda other than to see the place for myself, to feel its walls and its air, to meet the kind of people who might one day carry forward the weight and warmth of my life's work. The walk from the bus stop was short, just a few blocks along a quiet street lined with narrow brick buildings, their windows dressed with curtains that looked handmade, and I noticed how the morning light softened the edges of everything, even the cracked pavement and the uneven steps leading to the entrance. The building was modest, a 2-story structure with peeling paint around the doorframe and a bell that chimed softly when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was warm and held the faint scent of coffee and old paper, a smell that always makes me feel as though I have stepped into a place where work is done with care rather than hurry. The walls were covered with framed photographs, some in color and some in fading black and white, showing women in kitchens and gardens, at sewing machines and bookshelves, their expressions a mix of quiet dignity and cautious hope. There was a small reception desk with a vase of carnations beside a neat stack of flyers, and behind the desk sat a woman with silver hair pulled back into a simple knot, her hands resting on an open ledger. She looked up with an expression that was neither hurried nor distracted, and in that moment I felt the difference between being greeted as a formality and being welcomed as a person. She asked if I would like to meet someone from the program team, and before I knew it, I was being guided down a short hallway where the sound of voices and light laughter drifted from a room at the end. The door stood open, and inside were half a dozen women gathered around a long table covered with fabric swatches, mugs of tea, and a scattering of papers. Some were leaning close to help each other read forms. Others were talking about a community garden project planned for spring, and there was an ease in their movements that spoke of trust. I was introduced to a woman named Margaret, a tall figure with kind eyes and a voice that carried both strength and gentleness, and she explained, in the way people do when they have lived the truth of their work, that the foundation helped women who had reached an age where the world too often turned its head away, providing them with housing assistance, skills training, and simply a place to belong when belonging had been taken from them. I listened more than I spoke, letting their words fill in the spaces of my understanding. And as I stood there, I thought about how many lives had been shifted back onto steady ground by the hands of people in this very room. There was nothing grand about it. No polished speeches, no elaborate offices, just a sense of real work being done in a way that asked for no applause. I noticed a younger volunteer gently showing an older woman how to use a phone app to arrange transportation to a medical appointment, and the way they both leaned over the small screen as if it were the most important task in the world made me feel an unexpected swell of gratitude for their patience. Margaret invited me to join them for tea, and I found myself sitting at the table, listening to a conversation about winter coats being donated by a local shop. And for a moment I felt as though I were part of something quietly powerful, something built from small, steady acts that, when gathered together, could hold up a whole life. I thought about my own years, about the times when even a single act of kindness had felt like a rope thrown into deep water, and it struck me that the value of what I could leave behind would not just be in the dollars or the bricks and mortar, but in the sense of safety and possibility it could give to someone who had almost forgotten what those words meant. When I left the building, the air outside felt colder, but my steps were lighter. The decision that had begun as a quiet seed in my mind was now rooted deep, and I knew with certainty that I would follow through. I imagined my home one day becoming a place where another woman could find rest. My savings turned into the meals, books, and safe nights that someone else might desperately need. My stocks funding programs that would carry skills and confidence into the hands of women who had been told, directly or indirectly, that their time had passed. And as I walked back toward the bus stop, I understood something I had never quite been able to admit before. It was not just about giving to others. It was also about freeing myself from the quiet weight of expecting love and respect from someone who had shown me, in small ways over many years, that his priorities lived elsewhere. By the time I reached home, the late afternoon light was beginning to fade, and the warmth of my living room felt almost like an embrace. I set my bag down and stood for a moment, looking around at the space I had built over decades. The carefully chosen furniture, the photographs, the shelves of books, and I felt no sorrow at the thought of one day letting it go. Instead, there was a strange kind of joy in imagining it all transformed into something alive and useful long after I was gone. It was the first time in years I had felt that kind of anticipation, and as I sat down to write a short note to confirm my meeting with the attorney, I realized that the story of my life was no longer something fixed. It was still being written, and I had just taken hold of the pen. The morning of my appointment with the attorney began with that muted, silvery light that makes the world look as if it has been carefully washed clean during the night. the sky a smooth stretch of pale steel without a single cloud, the air holding just enough of a chill to remind you that winter waits quietly at the edge of the season. I moved through my small kitchen with slow, deliberate steps, almost ritual in their sequence, setting the kettle on the stove, feeling the faint warmth of the burner on my palm before the water began to stir, choosing the good china cup I kept tucked at the back of the cabinet because this morning felt like it deserved small honors. My breakfast was simple: 2 slices of toast, a little butter, a sliced pear, but I hardly tasted any of it. My mind already leaning forward toward the office downtown, toward the moment when my thoughts would stop being ideas and become ink on paper, fixed and undeniable. The folder with all my documents rested on the table beside me, a simple manila thing with a small crease along one edge from years of use. But inside, it held the tangible weight of decades, the deed to my home, the records of my savings, the careful notes about my small investments, each page a chapter of the quiet, persistent work that had built my life, piece by piece. The night before, I had gone through it all twice, smoothing the corners, placing the papers in precise order, even tucking a sheet of clean paper at the back in case I needed to make notes. There was a strange comfort in that neatness, in knowing that nothing was missing, because I could not bear the thought of standing in that office and realizing I had left something essential behind. As I buttoned my coat and wrapped my scarf around my neck, I caught sight of the phone sitting on the side table in the living room, its black screen reflecting the muted light from the window. For a heartbeat, I found myself wondering if this would be the morning my son might call, if some unspoken thread between us would pull at him and make him reach out, sensing that something in the shape of our lives was about to change. But the phone stayed silent, and I knew then that I could not let my steps be slowed by waiting for something that might never come. The bus ride was steady at first, the low hum of the engine and the faint rattle of windows a kind of background song, the building slipping past in a rhythm that almost calmed me, until the driver's voice, firm but apologetic, announced that the route ahead was closed for repairs and we would need to divert. The words landed in my chest with a sudden weight, because the appointment was timed so tightly that any significant delay could push it back for weeks, and the thought of carrying this decision uncompleted for that long made something in me tighten. When we were dropped at the alternate stop, I found myself in a part of downtown I didn't know well. The sidewalks here were narrower, the storefronts older, with faded signs in their windows and worn brass handles that had been turned 1,000 times. I held my folder close under my arm and started walking quickly, scanning for street signs, trying to piece together a route in my head, the cold air stinging my cheeks. Then, just as I turned a corner, a sudden gust of wind swept along the street like an impatient hand, slipping beneath the flap of my folder. Before I could react, one thin sheet slid forward and lifted into the air, catching the light as it twirled upward and drifted toward the gutter. In that instant, my body moved without thought, my feet lunging forward, my arms stretching out, my heart thudding against my ribs. The sound of a delivery truck approaching from behind thundered in my ears, its massive shadow stretching toward me. And for a terrifying second, I saw the page hovering just at the edge of the curb, ready to be crushed or carried out of sight forever. My fingers closed on it in the last possible moment, the paper crinkling in my grip as the truck roared past close enough that the wind of it lifted the ends of my scarf. I stood still for a moment, my breath quick and shallow, the paper trembling in my hand as though it knew how close it had come to being lost. If that document had slipped away, the trouble of replacing it, digging through records, waiting for processing, possibly rescheduling the appointment, could have been enough to make me pause, to let doubt creep back in and settle like dust over my resolve. But here it was, safe in my grasp, and the near loss made me realize just how deeply I wanted this done, how unwilling I was to leave this decision floating half-finished in the air. I tucked the paper back inside the folder, pressing the flap firmly closed, and held it tight against my chest for the rest of the walk, my pulse slowly returning to normal. When I finally reached the small brick building where the attorney's office was housed, the sight of the polished brass plaque beside the door felt like reaching the end of a steep climb. Inside, the lobby was quiet and warm, the air scented faintly with tulips from a vase on the reception desk. The receptionist's calm smile carried the unspoken understanding that most people who came through this door brought with them years of decisions, regrets, and hopes folded into their envelopes. She offered me a seat, and I settled into one of the soft chairs, letting my eyes drift over the framed certificates on the wall, the neatly stacked magazines on the table, the clock whose second hand ticked steadily forward, each movement carrying me closer to the moment I had been walking toward for weeks. The meeting itself moved at an unhurried pace, every page placed before me with careful explanation, each detail confirmed. When the pen touched paper, it was with the deliberate motion of someone planting a stake in the ground, marking the line between what had been and what would be. With each signature, the weight I had carried began to lift, replaced by a quieter, steadier kind of strength. By the time the final document was signed and stacked neatly together, I understood that there was no going back, and rather than fear, what settled into me was a deep calm, as though a room in my mind that had been crowded and noisy had finally been cleared and opened to light. Stepping back into the street, the earlier rush and panic felt far away, replaced by a slow satisfaction that carried me all the way to the bus stop. The folder under my arm no longer felt fragile but solid, as if the papers inside had become something unshakable. I thought about the way that gust of wind had almost taken one of them from me, how in that split second I had realized I would do anything to keep it safe. And it struck me that sometimes it takes a near loss to reveal just how deeply committed you are to the path you've chosen. That evening, sitting at my kitchen table with the folder beside me and a cup of tea warming my hands, I knew that what I had done was no longer just a decision. It was a promise, and it was one I intended to keep, no matter what came next. It was only a few days after I had left the attorney's office, the papers tucked neatly into their safe place in the cabinet beside my desk, when I noticed the first shift, so small at first that I might have missed it if I hadn't been living in such a heightened state of awareness. The phone rang one afternoon while I was in the garden pulling away the brittle stems of the last summer flowers, and seeing his name on the screen made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't name. It wasn't his habit to call in the middle of the week, and certainly not without some practical reason, yet here he was, his voice warmer than it had been in months, maybe years, asking about how I was, whether I was eating well, how the weather was in my part of town. The words themselves were harmless, almost pleasant, but something about the careful way they were spaced, the pauses between them, made me feel as if they had been rehearsed in his head before he spoke them aloud. Over the next several days, the attention continued. A message in the morning telling me he had been thinking about me, an offer to come by on the weekend and help fix the creak in my back gate, a suggestion that we should have dinner soon, maybe at that little Italian place we used to go to when he was still in school. Each time, I found myself searching his voice and his choice of words for clues, wondering whether this was the slow unwinding of neglect or the quick tightening of some other motive. The timing could have been coincidence, of course, but it hovered uncomfortably close to the moment when my will had quietly changed hands on paper, and that thought lingered at the edge of my mind like a shadow that grows longer the more you try not to look at it. When he arrived that Saturday, he carried a small paper bag with a loaf of bread from a bakery I liked, the kind of thoughtful gesture that once would have filled me with uncomplicated pleasure. He walked through the house noticing little things, commenting on the framed photographs, the vase of fresh flowers on the table, even the way the afternoon light fell across the rug. His tone was easy, even affectionate, but it had been so long since we had spoken like this that I couldn't tell whether I was simply out of practice at receiving it, or whether it had been carefully wrapped and presented for reasons other than love. I made tea, and we sat in the kitchen, the steam curling gently between us, and I listened to him talk about work, about the children, about how busy life had been, At one point, he mentioned, lightly, almost as if in passing, how he had been thinking about the future, about family staying connected, about making sure we all took care of each other. The words were delivered with such casualness that anyone else might have thought nothing of them, but I felt them land in my chest like a quiet thud. There was nothing overt in what he said, no direct mention of my home or my accounts, yet the shape of the thought was there, faint but distinct, like handwriting you can just make out through the back of a page. I told myself, as I have so many times before, that love should be given the benefit of the doubt, but the truth was I no longer knew whether the doubt or the benefit was the stronger force in me. I kept my expression soft, my voice even, and I let the conversation move on to safer ground. Still, when he left later that afternoon, his parting words warm and his hug lingering just a little longer than usual, I stood in the doorway, watching him walk away, and felt the wind stir in the empty space he left behind, carrying with it a question I wasn't ready to answer. That night, as I sat in my living room with the lamplight pooling gently across the table, I thought about how quickly a pattern can change when something shifts beneath it. For years, my birthdays, my milestones, my everyday life had passed quietly under his radar, but now, in the short space of a week, the rhythm was different, each beat sharper and more deliberate. It could have been guilt, it could have been affection, or it could have been something else entirely. I did not yet know. What I did know was that the decision I had made was now part of me in a way that could not be undone by warm words or familiar gestures, and that knowledge was both my anchor and my shield. As I turned out the light and prepared for bed, I realized I was walking a narrow bridge between hope and suspicion, each step careful, each glance behind me and ahead measured. I could not see the end of it yet, but I could feel in my bones that whatever lay waiting there would answer the question I had been carrying since the moment the first unexpected call had lit up my phone. It happened on a bright, unassuming afternoon, the kind of day when nothing in the air warns you that the ground is about to shift under your feet. I was in the kitchen rinsing a handful of apples for a pie when the phone rang, and before I even reached for it, I knew from the sharp tone in my son's voice that something had found its way to him. There was no greeting, no soft edge, only a tense demand to know whether it was true, whether I had really changed everything, whether I had erased his name from the documents that had once promised him my home, my savings, the quiet accumulation of a lifetime. I felt my hands go still in the sink, the cold water running over my fingers, and I knew in that moment that the hour I had been both expecting and dreading had arrived. The words tumbled from him in a rush, not shouted but clipped, the kind that cut more deeply for their restraint, and I stood there listening, not answering, because I had learned that sometimes silence is stronger than any explanation. When he finally stopped, the air heavy with what he thought was his victory in forcing a confession, I told him only that the papers were already signed, that everything was in place, that nothing could be undone. The pause on the other end was long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no softer. He said he understood, but the way he said it told me he had no intention of leaving it there. The days that followed were tense in the smallest ways, messages that seemed warm but carried an undertone, casual questions about my schedule, unexpected visits that felt more like inspections than drop-ins. I held my ground politely, never giving him more than I wanted him to have, until one afternoon, as I was coming back from the grocery store, I saw him talking to my neighbor near the fence. They both straightened when they saw me, and in that moment I understood that he had been trying to find out more, perhaps even hoping to learn something that would give him a way to challenge what I had done. It was almost a relief, because it meant my instincts had been right all along. The first twist came the following week, when I received a letter from the foundation, an official acknowledgement of my bequest, yes, but also an unexpected note that the transfer could be structured in a way that would allow part of the assets to be used immediately while I was still alive, to fund a new program in my name. They asked if I would be open to this, and as I read the details, a slow smile formed. It meant I would see the results of my decision with my own eyes, watch it take root, know exactly where my efforts were going. But more than that, it meant the truth of my choice would be public much sooner than anyone, including my son, might have expected. When the announcement appeared in the local paper a month later, with my photograph beside a small article about the new program for women in need, I received calls from neighbors, friends, even old colleagues I hadn't spoken to in years. The tone was warm, full of admiration, and yet I knew somewhere across town my son was reading the same words, seeing the same picture, understanding that the change was not only irreversible, but celebrated. That might have been the end of it, the quiet conclusion to a decision I had made with a steady heart. But the second, sharper twist was still to come. It arrived in the form of a letter, delivered by hand from my attorney. Inside was not only the confirmation of the signed documents, but also a smaller envelope addressed to me, sealed in the neat, precise handwriting I recognized instantly as my own. Weeks earlier, when I had finalized the will, the attorney had suggested I write a statement to be kept with it, one that would be read in the event of any dispute. I had done so without much thought at the time, but now, holding it in my hands, I realized its weight. Inside were only a few lines, but they carried the entire truth of what I wanted to say, that love is never measured in money, but respect is a currency that can never be replaced once it is spent carelessly. The attorney explained that my son had already been shown a copy of this statement when he came to inquire about challenging the will. It was, apparently, the final moment in which he understood that the choice had been made not out of anger, but out of clarity, and that there was no argument he could make against it without revealing more about himself than he wished the world to see. From what I was told, he had left the office quietly, and I imagined him walking down the long corridor, hearing those words echoing in his mind long after the door closed behind him. In the weeks that followed, the tension eased, not because we had reconciled in any way that restored what was lost, but because the air had cleared, the truth was no longer hidden in shadows, and both of us knew where we stood. The foundation began its work with the new program, and I attended the opening, standing in a modest room filled with laughter, warm coats hung on hooks, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air. I saw women talking in small groups, their faces lit with a quiet confidence that comes when you realize you are not as alone as you thought. And I knew with absolute certainty that this was where my legacy belonged. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote a short note, not to my son, but to myself, placing it in the drawer beside the original statement. It said only this: I have lived long enough to learn that not every story ends with everyone holding hands, but every person has the right to decide how their chapter closes. Mine closes here, with my heart steady, my conscience clean, and my eyes fixed on the good that will outlive me. And now, to anyone listening to my story, I ask you, have you ever had a single moment as small as a missed call change the course of everything you thought you knew? And if it happened to you, would you have the courage to turn that moment into the beginning of your own ending?